It was the evening of August 21st, 1986, and the villages surrounding Lake Nyos in northwestern Cameroon were settling into their nightly routines. Farmers returned from fields where they had spent the day tending cattle and crops, children played in dirt courtyards, while mothers prepared evening meals over cooking fires. The air was thick with the tropical humidity typical of Cameroon's rainy season, and the sun was setting behind the volcanic hills that ringed the lake, casting long shadows across the scattered settlements that dotted the landscape. Lake Nyos itself, a deep crater lake, filling an ancient volcanic maar, sat silent and undisturbed 2 kilometers away from the nearest village, its waters appearing deceptively calm in the fading light. The lake had always been there as far as anyone could remember, a permanent fixture of the landscape that provided water and fish, though local legend whispered that it was a dangerous place where evil spirits dwelled. Within hours, those legends would be validated in the most horrifying way imaginable, when the lake would release an invisible cloud of death that would suffocate entire communities as they slept, creating one of the most unusual and devastating natural disasters in recorded history. Lake Nyos occupied a volcanic crater, or maar, that had formed approximately 400 years earlier when groundwater came into contact with hot magma, causing a frenetic explosion that blasted out a circular depression nearly 2 kilometers across and over 200 meters deep. Over centuries, this crater gradually filled with rainwater and runoff from surrounding hills, creating what appeared to be a typical tropical lake, but beneath its placid surface, Lake Nyos was anything but typical. The lake sat directly atop a pocket of magma, remnant of the volcanic system that had created it. This magma continuously released carbon dioxide gas, which seeped upward through cracks and fissures in the bedrock, dissolving into the lake water at depth. Unlike typical lakes where water circulates and mixes seasonally, bringing oxygen-rich surface water to the depths and allowing dissolved gases to escape, Lake Nyos was meromictic, meaning its layers did not mix. The deep water remained perpetually isolated, growing progressively more saturated with dissolved carbon dioxide year after year, decade after decade, century after century, building toward a catastrophic threshold that no one recognized or understood. The phenomenon that makes Lake Nyos deadly is called Limnic Eruption, an extremely rare event where dissolved carbon dioxide suddenly erupts from deep lake water, similar to opening a vigorously shaken bottle of carbonated soda, but on a scale measured in cubic kilometers. Only 3 lakes in the world are known to have experienced this phenomenon. 2 of them, Lake Nyos and Lake Monon, are in Cameroon. The third is Lake Kivu on the border between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, which contains vastly more dissolved gas and threatens millions of people, but has not yet erupted. The rarity of limnic eruptions means that scientific understanding of the phenomenon was virtually non-existent in 1986. The disaster at Lake Nyos would become the catalyst for understanding this obscure but deadly natural hazard. The chemistry and physics underlying limnic eruptions are straightforward, once understood, but were poorly known before Lake Nyos demonstrated them so catastrophically. Carbon dioxide is highly soluble in water, especially cold water under pressure. The deep water of Lake Nyos, more than 200 meters below the surface, existed under tremendous pressure from the weight of water above it. This pressure, combined with the cold temperatures at depth, meant that the deep water could dissolve enormous quantities of carbon dioxide, far more than surface water could hold. As volcanic CO2 continuously seeped into the lake bottom, the deep water became progressively more saturated, like a carbonated beverage becoming more fizzy as CO2 is pumped into it under pressure. The water could theoretically hold this dissolved gas indefinitely, as long as it remained undisturbed at depth. But if something triggered mixing between the deep saturated water and the shallower water above, or if the deep water was brought toward the surface where pressure was lower, the dissolved CO2 would rapidly come out of solution, forming bubbles. These bubbles would make the water less dense, causing it to rise faster, which would bring it to even lower pressure, causing more gas to come out of solution, creating more bubbles, in a runaway positive feedback process called overturn. Scientists now believe that by August 1986, the deep water of Lake Nyos had reached critical saturation, holding as much dissolved CO2 as it possibly could under the existing pressure and temperature conditions. The lake was a loaded weapon waiting for a trigger. What exactly triggered the eruption remains debated even today, but the most likely explanation involves a landslide. Lake Nyos occupied a steep-sided crater with unstable slopes. Heavy rains in the weeks before the disaster had saturated the soil on these slopes. A section of the northern crater wall, estimated at several thousand cubic meters of rock and soil, likely collapsed into the lake sometime in the evening of August 21st. This landslide would have generated waves that propagated across the lake's surface, but more critically, it would have disturbed the deep water, initiating mixing between the saturated bottom layer and the water above. Once initiated, the overturn became self-sustaining and explosive. As saturated deep water rose toward the surface where pressure was lower, dissolved CO2 came out of solution, forming bubbles. The bubbles made the water less dense, causing it to rise faster, bringing more saturated water upward, creating more bubbles, accelerating the process. Within minutes, a fountain of gas-laden water erupted from the lake surface. Some reports suggest it reached heights of 80 to 100 meters, visible as a white plume in the darkness. Witnesses who survived at greater distances reported hearing a loud rumbling sound, like distant thunder or an underground explosion, followed by a sound like rushing wind. The eruption lasted for perhaps 15 to 20 minutes, though exact timing is uncertain because almost everyone close enough to observe it directly was killed. During this brief period, the lake released an estimated 1 cubic kilometer of carbon dioxide gas, approximately 1.6 million tons of CO2 in total, creating a dense invisible cloud that would flow down the surrounding valleys like water, suffocating every living thing in its path. Carbon dioxide is denser than air, approximately 1.5 times heavier, which meant the gas cloud released from Lake Nyos did not dissipate upward into the atmosphere as lighter gases would have done. Instead, it behaved like a liquid, flowing downhill along the path of least resistance, following valleys and low-lying areas away from the lake. The gas cloud was initially very dense and pure, essentially 100% CO2, though it mixed with air as it traveled, gradually becoming more diluted. Estimates suggest the cloud was initially 50 to 100 meters thick, a river of invisible death rolling silently through the darkness, at speeds estimated between 20 and 50 kilometers per hour, faster than people could run. The cloud's behavior was influenced by terrain and wind, splitting into multiple lobes that followed different valleys, ultimately affecting an area of approximately 25 kilometers from the lake, reaching villages that residents had never considered at risk from anything associated with the lake. Carbon dioxide is not chemically toxic like cyanide or arsenic. Its lethality is simpler and more fundamental. It kills by displacement and asphyxiation. At concentrations above 10%, CO2 causes immediate loss of consciousness. Above 20%, death occurs within minutes. The gas cloud from Lake Nyos, particularly in its initial dense form close to the lake, likely contained concentrations exceeding 30%. People and animals exposed to these concentrations would have had no warning, no time to react. They would have taken a breath, found it strangely unsatisfying, perhaps felt dizzy or confused for a few seconds, then collapsed unconscious. Death would follow within 2 to 3 minutes, as their bodies were deprived of oxygen. There was no struggle, no chance to flee, no possibility of helping others. The cloud moved too fast, the effect was too immediate, and the gas was completely invisible and odorless. The first village to be affected was Nyos itself, home to approximately 1,000 people, located just 2 kilometers from the lake along the valley that drained it. The gas cloud reached Nyos within minutes of the eruption. It flowed through the village like a flood, filling every depression, entering every structure, suffocating everyone. Some people were sitting by cooking fires, others were in their homes preparing for sleep, children were already in bed. They all died within minutes of each other, though the exact sequence is unknowable. Morning would reveal entire families dead in their homes, still in positions suggesting they had been going about their evening routines. Mothers were found holding infants, both dead. Elderly people were found in beds where they had been sleeping. A man was found collapsed outside his home, steps from his door, suggesting he had perhaps heard something, and stepped outside to investigate just as the cloud arrived. Of approximately 1,000 residents of Nyos village, only 6 survived, all of them people who happened to be on higher ground when the cloud passed below them. From Nyos, the cloud continued down the valley, splitting into multiple lobes as it encountered different terrain features. One lobe followed the valley northward toward the village of Cam, home to about 700 people. Another lobe continued down the main valley toward Sebun and Cha, settlements with combined population of about 300. The distances involved were substantial. Sebun was 10 kilometers from the lake, Cha was 14 kilometers away, and the gas remained sufficiently concentrated even at these distances to be lethal. This was not a localized effect around the lake's immediate vicinity, but a regional catastrophe affecting an area of hundreds of square kilometers. Cham village received the gas cloud approximately 30 to 40 minutes after the initial eruption, giving residents no warning and no chance to evacuate even if they had somehow known what was coming. The village was asleep when death arrived. The gas flowed through Cam just as it had through Nyos, silent and invisible, leaving no trace except the dead. Of the approximately 700 residents, fewer than 20 survived. Those who did survive were people who had been on elevated ground, sleeping in homes built on hillsides above the valley floor, or who had traveled away from the village that evening. One survivor described waking to find his entire family dead around him, his children, his wife, everyone silent and still. He ran from house to house finding the same scene repeated everywhere. Another survivor, a young woman, described waking feeling unable to breathe, stumbling outside where the air seemed slightly better, seeing neighbors collapsed in their courtyards, running in panic toward higher ground before losing consciousness herself. She woke hours later with a terrible headache and burning lungs but alive, one of the fortunate few. Sebum and Chao received more diluted concentrations of the gas because of their greater distance from the lake, but the cloud remained lethal even after traveling 10 to 15 kilometers. In Sebum, approximately 80 people died, about 60% of the population. In Chao, about 100 died, representing roughly 70% of residents. The variation in mortality rates at different locations reflected the local topography and how the gas cloud flowed through or around specific areas. Some homes sat just above the level the gas reached, their inhabitants surviving while neighbors 50 meters away in lower-lying areas died. The random nature of who lived and who died based on minor elevation differences made the tragedy even more cruel. Beyond the human toll, the gas cloud killed an estimated 3,000 cattle and countless other animals. Cattle were particularly vulnerable because they were kept in valley-bottom areas with the richest grass, exactly where the CO2 cloud was densest and most persistent. The next morning revealed fields full of dead cattle, thousands of them, lying where they had collapsed during the night. Dogs, chickens, wild animals, insects, everything that breathed air died if it was in the wrong place when the cloud passed. The ecological impact was profound. Even weeks later, visitors to the affected areas reported an eerie silence, no bird songs, no insect sounds, the normal background noise of tropical life completely absent. The first indication that something catastrophic had occurred came in the early morning hours of August 22 when survivors from outlying areas who had been away from their villages during the night began returning home. A man who had been visiting relatives in a distant village returned to find his entire family dead. He ran to neighboring villages seeking help, finding the same scenes of mass death everywhere. Another survivor managed to reach a mission station that had escaped the gas cloud because it was located on high ground. The missionaries there initially thought he was delirious, his story too impossible to believe, but when they accompanied him back toward the affected area and saw the scope of death, they realized something unprecedented had occurred. Communication in this remote region of Cameroon in 1986 was difficult. There were no phones in the villages, no radio stations, no way to quickly alert authorities. The nearest substantial town was Wum, about 30 kilometers away, and word had to be carried there by people traveling on foot or by whatever vehicles could be found. By midday on August 22, authorities in Wum began receiving confused reports about mass deaths near Lake Nyos. The reports seemed impossible, too many dead, too large an area affected, no visible cause, no signs of violence or disease. Initial speculation ranged wildly. Some thought it might be an epidemic, perhaps cholera or some other sudden disease outbreak. Others wondered if it could be related to poison gas from some unknown source, though there were no industrial facilities anywhere nearby. Some even speculated about chemical weapons, though there was no conflict in the region. Medical teams and government officials who reached the affected area on August 22 and 23 found scenes that would haunt them for life. Entire villages full of corpses, human and animal, all in positions suggesting they had died suddenly with no warning and no struggle. There was no sign of trauma, no wounds, no indication of what had killed them. Bodies showed peculiar characteristics. Many had skin discoloration, reddish marks, and blisters that suggested chemical burns, though the pattern made no sense for any known poison. The mystery deepened when rescuers noted that survivors, though relatively few in number, were suffering from respiratory problems, skin burns, confusion, and unconsciousness. Symptoms that suggested exposure to some kind of irritating gas, but not any gas that medical personnel could immediately identify. The Cameroon government, overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster and the complete mystery of its cause, requested international assistance. Teams of scientists, medical personnel, and disaster response experts began arriving from France, the United States, and other countries with expertise in natural disasters and unusual environmental hazards. These scientists faced an unprecedented challenge. There was no obvious source for any kind of poison gas. The lake itself showed strange characteristics. Its water level had dropped by approximately 1 meter overnight, with no obvious explanation for where the water had gone. The vegetation around the lake had been flattened in a pattern radiating outward, suggesting some kind of explosive event or strong wind, but there was no evidence of an explosion. The water in the lake had changed color, from blue to reddish-brown, suggesting something had disturbed the sediments at the bottom. The first breakthrough in understanding what had occurred came from water samples taken from Lake Nyos in the days immediately following the disaster. Analysis revealed extremely high concentrations of dissolved iron and other minerals in the surface water, chemicals that normally remained at the lake bottom. This suggested that deep water had somehow mixed with surface water, bringing bottom sediments and dissolved chemicals upward. More critically, measurements of dissolved gases in the lake water showed unusual concentrations of carbon dioxide, not in the surface water which had largely degassed, but in samples taken from depth. A French team measuring gas concentrations at various depths discovered that the lake still contained enormous amounts of dissolved CO2 even after the eruption, suggesting that the pre-eruption concentrations must have been extraordinarily high. As scientists pieced together evidence and consulted historical records, they discovered that Lake Nyos was not the first lake in Cameroon to experience this phenomenon. In 1984, just 2 years earlier, Lake Monoun, another volcanic crater lake about 100 kilometers southeast of Lake Nyos, had experienced a similar but smaller event that had killed 37 people. At the time, the cause had been mysterious and was never satisfactorily explained. Now, with the much larger disaster at Lake Nyos, scientists realized they were dealing with a previously unrecognized natural hazard, a limnic eruption caused by sudden release of dissolved volcanic gases from deep lake water. The scientific investigation revealed the specific characteristics that made Lake Nyos so dangerous. The lake was deep, over 200 meters at its deepest point, providing substantial depth where dissolved gases could accumulate under pressure. It was fed by groundwater seeping through volcanic rock, water that was naturally rich in volcanic CO2. The lake was stratified, with dense, cold, mineral-rich bottom water that did not mix with warmer surface water, creating the stable layering necessary for gases to accumulate over long periods. The lake had no significant surface outflow, meaning that gas-rich deep water could not gradually escape through a river system, but remained trapped at depth. These characteristics combined to create a natural pressure vessel that had been accumulating CO2 for decades or centuries until it reached critical saturation. The practical implications of this understanding were sobering. Lake Nyos remained dangerous. The eruption had released only a portion of the dissolved CO2 in the lake's deep water. Measurements suggested that perhaps 20% of the total dissolved gas had erupted, meaning 4 times as much remained at depth, gradually accumulating more CO2 from continuing volcanic inputs. Another eruption could occur at any time, potentially with even less warning than the first. The affected villages could not be safely reoccupied until the lake was somehow made safe, but no one initially knew how to degas a lake. The immediate aftermath of the disaster focused on humanitarian response and understanding what had occurred. Over 1,700 bodies needed to be buried. In the tropical heat, decomposition was rapid, and the sheer number of dead overwhelmed the capacity to properly process and identify bodies. Mass graves were dug, and most victims were buried in communal trenches with minimal identification. Families who had lost members often had no bodies to bury, the corpses already interred in mass graves before relatives could reach the area. The spiritual and psychological impact on survivors was profound. In a culture where proper funeral rites are essential for the deceased's journey to the afterlife, the inability to properly bury and memorialize the dead added spiritual anguish to the horror of mass bereavement. Survivors were evacuated from the affected areas and relocated to temporary camps, then gradually to resettlement villages established at safer distances from the lake. The government declared a 30-kilometer exclusion zone around Lake Nyos, though this was later reduced as scientists better understood the risk factors. Many survivors did not want to return to the area even when told it might be safe to do so. The lake had betrayed them. What had seemed a benign landscape feature had become associated with death and loss. Some survivors experienced severe psychological trauma, nightmares, anxiety, depression, and survivor's guilt. Support services for trauma were minimal in rural Cameroon in the 1980s, and many survivors struggled for years with untreated psychological wounds. The international scientific community recognized that Lake Nyos presented an ongoing hazard that required active intervention. Doing nothing meant another eruption would inevitably occur, potentially with similar or greater casualties. But degassing a lake containing millions of tons of dissolved CO2 was an unprecedented engineering challenge. Various proposals were considered. Some scientists suggested using explosives to deliberately trigger a controlled eruption that would release the gas in a managed way. Others worried that explosives might trigger an even larger uncontrolled eruption. Some proposed pumping deep water to the surface where reduced pressure would allow the CO2 to escape gradually. Others suggested installing siphon pipes that would continuously bring deep water upward, degassing it in a controlled fashion. The solution eventually implemented, after years of research, planning, and initial small-scale tests, was a passive degassing system using siphon pipes. In 2001, 15 years after the disaster, the first degassing pipe was installed in Lake Nyos. The system was elegant in its simplicity. A long pipe was lowered to a depth of 200 meters where the water was most saturated with CO2. A pump was used to initially start water flowing up the pipe. Once water from depth reached the low-pressure environment near the surface, dissolved CO2 came out of solution, forming bubbles that made the water less dense. This buoyancy kept the water rising up the pipe without additional pumping, creating a self-sustaining siphon that brought deep water continuously to the surface where the CO2 could safely escape into the atmosphere. The first pipe created a spectacular fountain of fizzing water that shot 30 to 40 meters into the air, visible for kilometers, a constant reminder of the invisible danger that remained beneath the lake's surface. The fountain released approximately 20 liters of water per second, which contained approximately 5 kilograms of CO2 per second. Running continuously, one pipe could remove about 150 tons of CO2 per year. Given that the lake contained an estimated 300 million cubic meters of gas-saturated water holding approximately 200 million tons of CO2, one pipe would require centuries to fully degas the lake. Additional pipes were installed in subsequent years, including a second pipe in 2011 that increased degassing rates substantially. As of recent assessments, the degassing project is working but remains incomplete. The lake's CO2 levels have decreased significantly but not yet to levels considered completely safe. The project continues, requiring ongoing maintenance, monitoring and eventual installation of additional pipes to fully eliminate the hazard. The Lake Nyos disaster prompted investigation of Lake Manone and Lake Kivu, the only other known lakes at risk of limnic eruption. Lake Manone, site of the 1984 eruption that killed 37 people, was equipped with degassing pipes in 2003. The system there has successfully reduced dissolved CO2 to safe levels. Lake Kivu presents a far more complex situation. Much larger than Lake Nyos, approximately 90 kilometers long and 50 kilometers wide, Lake Kivu sits on the border between Rwanda and Democratic Republic of Congo, and contains approximately 250 cubic kilometers of dissolved CO2 and 60 cubic kilometers of dissolved methane, vastly more gas than Lake Nyos ever held. An eruption of Lake Kivu could affect more than 2 million people living along its shores. The presence of methane adds explosive potential that Lake Nyos lacked. However, Lake Kivu's size and depth create different dynamics than Lake Nyos. The lake is less likely to experience a sudden complete overturn, though localized gas releases remain possible. Current efforts at Lake Kivu focus on extracting dissolved methane as an energy resource, a process that simultaneously degasses the lake while producing valuable fuel, creating economic incentives for safety measures. The Lake Nyos disaster fundamentally changed scientific understanding of obscure but real natural hazards. Before 1986, limnic eruptions were unknown to science. The phenomenon had no name, no documented examples, no theoretical framework for prediction or prevention. The deaths at Lake Nyos forced scientists to recognize and characterize this hazard, leading to systematic surveys identifying potentially dangerous lakes worldwide. The disaster demonstrated that even in areas without obvious industrial hazards, natural landscapes can harbor deadly risks that require scientific investigation and active management. It challenged assumptions about what constitutes a natural disaster, expanding the definition beyond familiar categories like earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, hurricanes, and floods to include phenomena that occur on geological timescales and give no warning before catastrophic release. The disaster also exposed vulnerabilities in how warnings about environmental hazards reach and affect vulnerable populations. Even after scientists identified Lake Nyos as dangerous and recommended evacuation until degassing could be completed, many of the original survivors wanted to return to their ancestral lands. The villages around Lake Nyos had existed for generations. People had deep connections to the land, to graves of ancestors, to fields they had cultivated, to homes they had built. Being told by outsiders, foreign scientists, and distant government officials that they could not return to their homes created resentment and resistance. Some people did return illegally, despite the exclusion zone, believing that the danger was exaggerated or that traditional spiritual protections would keep them safe. This tension between scientific risk assessment and local knowledge and autonomy remains a challenge in managing environmental hazards worldwide. Educational and cultural impacts of the disaster were significant. Lake Nyos became a case study in earth science, environmental science, and disaster management curricula worldwide. The unique characteristics of limnic eruptions, the detective work required to identify the cause, and the engineering solutions developed to prevent recurrence provide rich material for teaching about how science responds to unprecedented events. Within Cameroon, the disaster became part of national consciousness, a tragedy that prompted both grief and pride in how the nation responded. International cooperation in investigating the disaster and developing solutions demonstrated the value of scientific collaboration across borders. The ongoing degassing project serves as a symbol of long-term commitment to public safety, a reminder that some hazards require not just emergency response but sustained decades-long interventions. The human stories behind the statistics are what give the Lake Nyos disaster its lasting emotional impact. 1,746 people died, but each was an individual with a name, a family, dreams, and a future that was stolen in minutes. A young couple who had been married just months earlier died together in their home. A schoolteacher who had been preparing lessons for the next week died at his desk, papers still scattered around him. A farmer who had been planning to plant a new field died in his sleep, never knowing what killed him. Children died who had been excited about an upcoming festival. Elderly people died who had survived colonialism, war, and decades of hardship only to be killed by an invisible gas from a lake they had lived beside their entire lives without fear. The survivors carried forward memories and grief that shaped the rest of their lives. Children who survived but lost parents and siblings grew up orphaned, often separated from their communities and relocated to distant areas. They carried trauma and loss that affected their education, relationships, and sense of identity. Adults who survived but lost spouses and children struggled with survivor's guilt, depression, and the practical challenges of rebuilding lives after losing everything. The psychological wounds were as real as any physical injury, and in many cases lasted longer and hurt deeper. Support systems for mass trauma were inadequate, and many survivors received little help processing their experiences. Some found solace in religious faith, interpreting the disaster through spiritual frameworks that provided meaning and comfort. Others struggled with anger, at fate, at God, at the lake itself, at the government, for not warning them of danger no one had known existed. The economic impact extended beyond the immediate death toll and property loss. The region around Lake Nyos was agricultural, and the loss of so many farmers, their cattle, and the contamination of farmland with decomposing bodies disrupted food production for years. The government faced enormous costs for emergency response, relocation of survivors, ongoing scientific investigation, and eventually the degassing project. International aid organizations provided assistance, but resources were never adequate for the scale of need. The disaster occurred in one of Cameroon's poorest regions, where people had few economic resources to begin with, and even less capacity to recover from catastrophic loss. Many survivors remained in poverty decades after the disaster, unable to rebuild to even their pre-disaster standard of living. Lessons learned from Lake Nyos have been applied to understanding and managing other natural hazards worldwide. The disaster demonstrated the importance of geological and geochemical monitoring of natural features that might pose risks. It showed that scientific investigation following disasters can identify previously unknown hazards, enabling prediction and prevention of similar events. It highlighted the need for long-term commitment to hazard management, as the degassing project demonstrates that some solutions require decades of sustained effort. It revealed the challenge of communicating scientific risk assessment to affected populations in ways that respect local knowledge and autonomy while protecting public safety. It underscored the value of international scientific cooperation in addressing hazards that transcend national boundaries and local expertise. The memorial established near Lake Nyos serves as a place where survivors and descendants of victims can come to remember and mourn. It includes a monument listing the names of the dead, though the list is incomplete, because many victims were never formally identified. The memorial site overlooks the lake, which remains beautiful and serene, its appearance giving no hint of the death it released. The lake's surface is marred only by the fountain from the degassing pipes, a constant plume of water and gas rising into the sky, a visible reminder that the danger has not been eliminated, but only managed, and that vigilance must continue indefinitely. Today, scientists believe that with continued degassing, Lake Nyos will eventually be rendered safe, its dissolved gas reduced to levels that cannot support a catastrophic eruption. But the time frame is uncertain, and the project requires ongoing maintenance and monitoring. The pipes must be cleaned of mineral deposits that accumulate and reduce their efficiency. New pipes must be periodically installed to replace old ones and increase degassing rates. Water chemistry must be continuously monitored to track dissolved gas levels and detect any changes that might indicate increased volcanic activity underground. The lake will require active management essentially forever, a permanent commitment to preventing the landscape from killing again. The international response to the Lake Nyos disaster revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of global disaster response systems in the 1980s. French scientists arrived first, given Cameroon's status as a former French colony. American scientists from the United States Geological Survey followed, bringing sophisticated equipment. Japanese, British and Italian teams contributed additional expertise. This collaboration was essential because no single country possessed expertise in a phenomenon that had never been scientifically documented before. The scientific investigation itself carried risks. When teams began taking water samples from Lake Nyos in late August 1986, they did not know whether their activities might trigger another release. Lowering sampling equipment could theoretically disturb the stratified water layers. Initial sampling was done cautiously, taking water from progressively greater depths while monitoring for any signs of gas release. Analysis of lake sediments revealed that limnic eruptions at Lake Nyos might occur on timescales of centuries, with each eruption followed by a long period of gas accumulation before conditions became critical again. This understanding provided context for the 1986 disaster as part of a recurring natural cycle. The medical investigation provided important data about carbon dioxide's physiological effects at high concentrations. Many survivors showed burn-like lesions on their skin, which scientists determined were caused by the acidic nature of CO2 dissolved in skin moisture. Some survivors experienced long-term respiratory problems and neurological effects. The challenge of disposing of thousands of corpses in tropical climate with limited infrastructure tested Cameroonian authorities severely. Traditional burial practices were physically impossible given the numbers and urgent timeline. The decision to use mass graves was necessary but culturally devastating, denying families traditional funeral rites and adding spiritual injury to trauma. The resettlement of survivors disrupted social structures, kinship networks and land rights. New villages often had less fertile land and inadequate water supplies. Housing deteriorated rapidly. Extended families were separated, and traditional authority structures collapsed. Economic recovery proved profoundly difficult. The disaster killed cattle, the most valuable assets families owned. Resettlement plots were small and unfamiliar. Without capital or livestock, survivors struggled to rebuild even modest pre-disaster living standards. Children who lost parents faced particular challenges. When entire extended families were wiped out, traditional support systems failed. Many orphans ended up in poorly funded institutions. Educational disruption, combined with trauma, affected their development permanently. Scientific monitoring after the disaster showed CO2 continuing to accumulate, meaning another eruption would eventually occur without intervention. This reinforced the necessity of the degassing project and permanent management. The degassing technology development took over a decade of research. Pipes had to withstand pressure differentials, while being manageable with limited equipment in a remote location, Materials had to resist corrosion from CO2-rich water. Mineral deposits accumulated inside pipes, requiring regular cleaning. The project evolved through trial and error over many years. The disaster influenced thinking about risk communication. How do you convince people that a calm, beautiful lake is deadly dangerous? Traditional hazard education focuses on observable threats. Limnic eruption risk lacks tangible characteristics. Community resistance to accepting the hazard was substantial, with some viewing warnings as attempts to steal land or government control. The economic costs exemplify burdens that natural disasters impose on developing nations. Immediate and long-term costs ran into tens of millions of dollars. International funding was inconsistent and often inadequate. When funding gaps occurred, maintenance was deferred, increasing risk. The cultural dimensions reveal how such events disrupt intangible aspects of community life. When elders died, oral traditions, songs, stories, traditional knowledge, agricultural practices, and craft techniques were lost. This cultural loss was permanent and irreparable. International media coverage was dramatic but brief. Initial headlines generated resources for relief, but attention declined within months. This pattern of intense but brief attention, followed by neglect, is common in disaster coverage. The disaster's impact on scientific careers was noteworthy. Researchers built reputations on Lake Nyos studies, advancing careers through papers in prestigious journals. This scientific productivity built on tragedy was uncomfortable for some, yet the work was necessary and valuable. Political dimensions revealed tensions between national sovereignty and international involvement. Questions about authority over safety decisions, exclusion zones, and data control intersected with post-colonial relationships. French involvement was particularly sensitive, given Cameroon's colonial history. The 1,746 people who died on August 21, 1986, went to sleep expecting to wake the next morning. They had evening meals to finish, conversations to complete, children to tuck into bed, plans for the next day. They never got the chance. They died in their homes, in their sleep, with no warning, no pain, no opportunity to say goodbye or even to understand what was happening. Their deaths were the price paid for humanity's limited understanding of Earth's complex and sometimes deadly geochemical processes. The disaster they experienced led to knowledge that has prevented similar deaths elsewhere, but that knowledge came too late for them. Their names are carved in stone at the memorial, looking out over the lake that killed them, a reminder that the natural world, however beautiful and tranquil it appears, can harbor invisible dangers that demand our respect, our vigilance, and our commitment to never letting preventable disasters claim more lives. The fountain still rises from Lake Nyos, a plume of water and gas reaching toward the sky, a testament to human determination to tame a dangerous landscape and ensure that the degassing technology development took over a decade of research. Pipes had to withstand pressure differentials while being manageable with limited equipment in a remote location. Materials had to resist corrosion from CO2-rich water. Mineral deposits accumulated inside pipes, requiring regular cleaning. The project evolved through trial and error over many years. The disaster influenced thinking about risk communication. How do you convince people that a calm, beautiful lake is deadly dangerous? Traditional hazard education focuses on observable threats. Limnic eruption risk lacks tangible characteristics. Community resistance to accepting the hazard was substantial, with some viewing warnings as attempts to steal land or government control. The economic costs exemplify burdens that natural disasters impose on developing nations. Immediate and long-term costs ran into tens of millions of dollars. International funding was inconsistent and often inadequate. When funding gaps occurred, maintenance was deferred, increasing risk. The cultural dimensions reveal how such events disrupt intangible aspects of community life. When elders died, oral traditions, songs, stories, traditional knowledge, agricultural practices, and craft techniques were lost. This cultural loss was permanent and irreparable. International media coverage was dramatic but brief. Initial headlines generated resources for relief, but attention declined within months. This pattern of intense but brief attention followed by neglect is common in disaster coverage. The disaster's impact on scientific careers was noteworthy. Researchers built reputations on Lake Nyos studies, advancing careers through papers in prestigious journals. This scientific productivity built on tragedy was uncomfortable for some, yet the work was necessary and valuable. Political dimensions revealed tensions between national sovereignty and international involvement. Questions about authority over safety decisions, exclusion zones, and data control intersected with post-colonial relationships. French involvement was particularly sensitive given Cameroon's colonial history. The 1,746 people who died on August 21, 1986, went to sleep expecting to wake the next morning. They had evening meals to finish, conversations to complete, children to tuck into bed, plans for the next day. They never got the chance. They died in their homes in their sleep, with no warning, no pain, no opportunity to say goodbye or even to understand what was happening. Their deaths were the price paid for humanity's limited understanding of Earth's complex and sometimes deadly geochemical processes. The disaster they experienced led to knowledge that has prevented similar deaths elsewhere, but that knowledge came too late for them. Their names are carved in stone at the memorial, looking out over the lake that killed them, a reminder that the natural world, however beautiful and tranquil it appears, can harbor invisible dangers that demand our respect, our vigilance, and our commitment to never letting preventable disasters claim more lives. The fountain still rises from Lake Nyos, a plume of water and gas reaching toward the sky, a testament to human determination to tame a dangerous landscape and ensure that the lake that once killed so many will never kill again.